Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling family conspiracies in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will unsettle you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that terrorized an entire region for nearly 2 decades, where a single family defied all moral boundaries and left a legacy so dark that even today, residents of Pike County refuse to speak the family name aloud. It was the year 1897. The Gilded Age was transforming America's cities with electric lights and industrial might. But in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, the situation was vastly different. There, between mist-covered peaks and valleys so deep that sunlight barely penetrated before noon, communities lived virtually isolated from the rest of the world. Pike County stretched across some of the most unforgiving terrain in Appalachia, a landscape of limestone caves, hidden hollows, and forests so dense that a man could disappear 20 feet from a trail and never be found. The mountains had their own rules, their own justice, their own secrets, and in a hollow known only as Devil's Fork, one family had learned to use the mountain's darkness to their advantage. Devil's Fork was not a place you stumbled upon by accident. The hollow sat tucked between 2 ridges, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense rhododendron thickets and across a creek that turned violent during spring rains. The few families who lived there, perhaps a dozen households total, rarely ventured to the county seat at Pikeville, and when they did, they spoke little and kept their eyes down. The Mullins family had occupied the deepest part of Devil's Fork for 3 generations. Their homestead consisted of a large cabin built from chestnut logs, now blackened with age and smoke, and several outbuildings that seemed to lean against the hillside as if trying to hide. The patriarch, Ezekiel Mullins, was a man of substantial build and penetrating eyes that seemed to hold the weight of terrible knowledge. His wife Sarah was thin as a rail and silent as stone, her face carved into permanent lines of resignation. But it was their children who gave the family its particular character. 7 of them, ranging from ages 12 to 32. The eldest, Jacob, had his father's build and something darker, a coldness that made even hardened mountain men uncomfortable in his presence. Then came twins Martha and Mary, who moved in uncanny synchronization and finished each other's sentences. The younger children, Daniel, Ruth, Samuel, and little Ezra, seemed normal enough on the surface, but there was something in the way they looked at outsiders, something calculating. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in the 1890s were already known for their isolation and fierce independence. The Civil War had left deep scars here, with brother turning against brother, and the wounds had never quite healed. Federal authority was a distant concept, represented only by a circuit judge who came through twice a year, and a sheriff whose jurisdiction covered hundreds of square miles of impossible terrain. In this vacuum of law, families often settled disputes themselves. Blood feuds could span generations. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves, and if people disappeared in these mountains, well, that happened sometimes. Bears, falls, getting lost in the endless maze of hollers and ridges. But starting in the spring of 1897, the disappearances in Pike County began to follow a pattern that even the mountain folk, accustomed to harsh realities, found deeply disturbing. The first to vanish was a peddler named Thomas Wickham. He had been making his rounds through the mountain communities, selling needles, thread, tobacco, and various sundries from a pack loaded onto a mule. Wickham was known as a talker, friendly, curious, always asking questions about the land and the people. He'd been seen entering Devil's Fork on a Tuesday morning in April. He never came out. When his wife reported him missing to Sheriff William Bowling in Pikeville, the lawman made the 2-day journey into the mountains to investigate. The trail to Devil's Fork was muddy from spring rains, and Bowling's horse struggled with the terrain. When he finally reached the Mullins homestead, he found Ezekiel sitting on the porch, whittling. "Sheriff," Ezekiel said, not looking up from his work. "Long way to come for nothing. Looking for a peddler named Wickham. He was seen heading this direction." Seen lots of folks heading lots of directions. The knife continued its rhythmic scraping. "Don't mean they all get where they're going." Sheriff Bowling dismounted, his hand resting casually near his revolver. "You see him or not?" "Might have." Man with a mule, stopped for water, moved on toward Laurel Ridge. Ezekiel finally looked up, his eyes flat and unrevealing. "Mountains are dangerous, Sheriff. Man could fall, get bit by a copperhead, all manner of accidents." The sheriff searched the area but found nothing. No body, no mule, no pack of goods. Just the mountains keeping their secrets. And a family that watched him with those calculating eyes until he rode away. 3 weeks later, a young couple traveling to visit family in the next county disappeared. Then a drifter looking for work. Then an old woman who'd been gathering ginseng root in the hills and never returned home. All last seen near Devil's Fork. By autumn of 1897, Sheriff Bowling had 5 missing persons cases and not a shred of physical evidence. The mountain communities were whispering now, but whispers in Appalachia were wind, shapeless, untraceable, impossible to pin down in a court of law. No one would speak openly. Fear had settled over Pike County like morning fog, thick and paralyzing. What Sheriff Bowling didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that beneath the mountains themselves, in the vast network of limestone caves that honeycomb the region, the Mullins family had created something monstrous. The caves of eastern Kentucky are legendary. Some are small, just crevices in the rock where a man might shelter from rain. Others stretch for miles, with vast chambers and underground streams that have carved cathedral-like spaces in the ancient stone. The Mullins family, who had lived on that land for decades, knew these caves intimately. They knew which entrances could be hidden behind rhododendron thickets. They knew which passages led deep into the earth, far from any trail. They knew which chambers stayed dry even in heavy rains, and they knew that sound doesn't travel well through solid rock. It was Jacob, the eldest son, who had first suggested using the caves. According to testimony that would emerge later, he had discovered a particular cavern, accessible only by crawling through a narrow passage concealed by brush, that opened into a space roughly 30 feet across. The ceiling was high enough to stand in. A small stream trickled through one corner, providing water, and most importantly, it was absolutely invisible from the outside world. The family, working together with the coordination of a military operation, began to develop what could only be called a systematic process. When travelers passed through Devil's Fork, particularly those who appeared to be alone, who carried valuables who wouldn't be immediately missed, the family would evaluate them. Ezekiel and Jacob had final say. If a victim was chosen, the family moved with practiced efficiency. Sometimes it was Martha and Mary, the twins, who would approach a traveler with offers of food or shelter. Their feminine presence lowered guards. They were beautiful in that stark mountain way, with long dark hair and pale skin. By the time a traveler realized something was wrong, Jacob and the others would emerge from the trees. Other times it was more direct. A rock thrown from concealment, a knife in the back on a lonely trail. The mountains were full of accidents after all. The bodies, and whatever possessions the victims carried, would be transported to the cave. In that dark chamber, by the light of oil lamps that cast monstrous shadows on limestone walls, the family would strip the bodies of anything valuable: money, jewelry, quality clothes, tools, weapons. These items would be carefully hidden in various locations throughout the property, or traded through intermediaries in distant counties where questions wouldn't be asked. The bodies themselves presented more of a challenge. The family tried various methods at first. Burial in the cave floor was difficult. The stone was too hard and the thin layer of dirt wasn't deep enough. Attempting to carry corpses far from the homestead was risky and exhausting. They couldn't simply leave bodies near their property, as that would eventually draw attention. The solution they settled upon was as practical as it was horrifying. The cave system had several deep vertical shafts, natural chimneys in the rock that dropped into unknown darkness below. These shafts were narrow at the top, perhaps 3 feet across, but they went down, way down. Far enough that a body dropped into them would disappear completely, falling into underground streams or chambers that no human had ever seen. The family would simply push the corpses into these stone throats and let the earth swallow them whole. According to later testimony from Samuel, the youngest boy who would eventually break, his father would stand at the edge of these shafts after disposing of a body and whisper the same thing each time. The mountains remember. The mountains keep. Through 1898 and into 1899, the disappearances continued. A Baptist preacher traveling between congregations, twin boys who'd gone hunting, a young woman running from an abusive husband, a wounded Union soldier decades after the war, who'd been making his way to family in Virginia. The pattern was there for anyone who looked closely. People entering Devil's Fork and never emerging. But Sheriff Bowling's hands were tied. Without bodies, without witnesses willing to testify, without any physical evidence, he couldn't arrest anyone. Mountain justice was private justice, and the legal system required proof. All he had was suspicion, and suspicion wasn't enough. The Mullins family grew bolder. They acquired a wagon to transport larger goods. They built additions to their outbuildings to store stolen property. Jacob took to wearing a fine silver pocket watch that had belonged to the missing preacher. Sarah Mullins was seen in Pikeville wearing a dress far too fine for a mountain woman, made from fabric that matched descriptions of material the missing young woman had been carrying. Still, no one spoke directly. No one pointed fingers. Fear was a living thing in Pike County now, breathing down necks, whispering warnings. The Mullins family was large, capable of violence, and protected by the mountains themselves. Who would risk becoming the next to disappear? The unraveling began not with police work but with accident. In September of 1899, two young men from Pikeville, brothers named Joshua and Caleb Reed, decided to explore the cave systems near Devil's Fork. They were experienced hunters and trappers, familiar with the mountains, and they'd heard stories of vast chambers filled with beautiful rock formations. Against local advice, they packed supplies and headed into the wilderness. The Reed brothers found the main cave entrance easily enough. It was known locally, though rarely visited due to superstitious fear and its proximity to Mullins land. They spent hours exploring the passages, marveling at stalactites and underground pools. Then Caleb, who had crawled ahead into a narrow tunnel, called out to his brother. His voice was strange, tight with something between confusion and horror. "Joshua, you need to see this." The narrow passage opened into the chamber the Mullins family had been using for 2 years. What the Reed brothers saw by lamplight would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The cavern wasn't empty. Along the walls, arranged with disturbing orderliness, were piles of possessions: clothes, shoes, bags, tools, books, even children's toys. Dozens of items, perhaps hundreds, all sorted by type. In one corner, a pile of hats. In another, boots. A third pile consisted entirely of jewelry, rings, watches, brooches, all jumbled together like pirate treasure. But it was the smell that told the real story. Even in the cave's cool dampness, there was an unmistakable scent of decay. Faint but present, it seemed to emanate from the dark shafts that opened in the cave floor like mouths. Joshua Reed, who was the elder brother by 2 years and possessed more presence of mind, made a decision that would change everything. "Don't touch anything," he told Caleb, "not one thing. We leave now quiet and we go straight to Sheriff Bowling." The brothers backed out of the cave carefully, marking the route so they could find it again. They moved through the mountains as quickly as darkness and terrain allowed, not stopping even to sleep. By dawn, they were pounding on the sheriff's door in Pikeville. Sheriff Bowling listened to their account with growing intensity. He'd been waiting 2 years for a break in this case, and now it had literally fallen into his lap, or rather, had been crawled into by 2 brothers who hadn't known what they'd find. But Bowling was experienced enough to know that moving hastily could ruin everything. The Mullins family was dangerous. They knew the terrain intimately, and they were numerous enough to mount serious resistance. He needed help. He needed a plan, and he needed evidence that would hold up when this went to trial. Over the next 3 days, Sheriff Bowling assembled a posse. He sent word to the U.S. Marshal in Lexington, requesting federal assistance given the scope of the suspected crimes. He recruited 12 men from Pikeville, all experienced with firearms, all trustworthy. He met with the county prosecutor to discuss what evidence they would need to secure convictions. On September 19, 1899, the posse rode into the mountains before dawn. They moved quietly, splitting into 3 groups. One group, led by the sheriff, would approach the Mullins homestead directly. Another would block the trail leading away from Devil's Fork. The third, including the Reed brothers, would secure the cave entrance. The morning was cool and damp, with fog hanging in the valleys like cotton batting. The sheriff's group reached the Mullins property just as the first light was breaking over the ridges. Ezekiel was already awake, sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees. "Sheriff," he said calmly, as if he'd been expecting this moment, "you're trespassing." "Ezekiel Mullins," Bowling called from horseback, his own rifle at the ready. "I have a warrant for your arrest and the arrest of your family on suspicion of murder and robbery." For a long moment nothing moved. The fog swirled. Birds called from the forest. Then Sarah appeared in the doorway behind Ezekiel, and her thin voice carried across the clearing. "It's over, Zeke." Something changed in Ezekiel's face then. The hardness cracked, just for an instant, revealing something underneath that might have been resignation or perhaps even relief. He lowered his rifle slowly and stood. "Jacob," he called toward the cabin. "Come out. All of you. It's done." One by one, the Mullins children emerged. Jacob came last, his hand hovering near a revolver at his belt. Sheriff Bowling tensed, but Jacob's hand moved away from the weapon. He looked at his father, nodded once, and placed both hands behind his head. The arrest was almost anticlimactic after years of terror. The family was shackled and loaded into the wagon. As they were led away, Daniel, one of the middle children, began to weep. Ruth stared straight ahead, her face blank. The twins held hands, silent as always. But the real confirmation came from the cave. The Reed brothers guided the third posse group to the hidden entrance, and Sheriff Bowling himself crawled through the narrow passage into the Chamber of Horrors. What he saw there, he would later tell the prosecutor, was evidence of systematic murder on a scale he couldn't quite comprehend. The possessions were meticulously examined and catalogued. Items were matched to missing persons reports going back not just 2 years but 5. The Mullins family, it became clear, had been operating much longer than anyone realized. The preacher's Bible with his name inscribed inside, the Union soldier's discharge papers, a woman's wedding ring engraved with names and a date, a child's doll hand-sewn matching a description from a family who'd lost their daughter 3 years prior, and the shafts. Sheriff Bowling dropped a torch into one of them and watched it fall, tumbling down into darkness, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. He never saw it hit bottom. The depth was impossible to estimate, but it was deep enough to swallow the evidence of multiple murders. The county hired miners to attempt to explore the shafts. They managed to descend about 70 feet in one of them before the passage became too narrow and unstable to continue. Even at that depth, they reported, the shaft continued downward into blackness. They also reported finding fabric remnants caught on stone protrusions and bones, human bones, they believed, though they couldn't retrieve them safely. The technical impossibility of recovering bodies would create challenges in prosecution, but the sheer volume of victims' possessions, combined with witness testimony that would soon emerge, painted an undeniable picture of mass murder. The trial of the Mullins family began in December of 1899 and became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Kentucky history. The courthouse in Pikeville was packed every day, with people traveling from surrounding counties to witness justice being served on the family that had terrorized their region. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Marcus Thornton, built his case methodically. He presented the stolen possessions one by one, matching them to missing persons reports and testimony from grieving families who identified items belonging to their lost loved ones. A mother wept openly when shown her son's pocket knife. A husband collapsed when he recognized his wife's pearl necklace. But the most damning testimony came from within the Mullins family itself. Samuel, the youngest son at age 12, broke under the weight of what he'd witnessed. In a voice barely above a whisper, he told the court everything. He described how his father and older brother would scout for victims, how Martha and Mary would lure travelers with promises of hospitality, how the entire family would work together to ambush and kill their victims, then transport the bodies to the cave. He described the shafts where bodies were disposed of. He knew of 4 different ones used over the years. He estimated the number of victims at between 30 and 40 people, though he couldn't be certain of exact numbers. "Did you participate in any of the killings?" Thornton asked gently. "No, sir," Samuel whispered. "I was too young, but I watched. They made me watch. Pa said I needed to learn. Learn what? How to survive in the mountains. How to take what you need. How to keep secrets." The defense attorney, a hapless young man from Lexington, who'd drawn the short straw in being assigned this case, tried to argue that without bodies the prosecution couldn't prove murder had occurred. But the sheer weight of evidence, the possessions, Samuel's testimony, the cave itself made such arguments hollow. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On December 22, 1899, the jury returned guilty verdicts for Ezekiel, Sarah, Jacob, Martha, and Mary Mullins on multiple counts of first-degree murder and robbery. Daniel and Ruth were convicted as accessories. Samuel, given his age and cooperation, was sentenced to reformatory school. Judge Harrison McCallum, a stern man with white whiskers and no tolerance for moral weakness, delivered the sentences without emotion. Ezekiel, Sarah, and Jacob were condemned to death by hanging. Martha and Mary received life imprisonment. Daniel and Ruth received 20 years each. The execution was scheduled for March 3, 1900. On that cold morning, a crowd of nearly 500 people gathered in Pikeville to witness justice carried out. 3 gallows had been erected in the courthouse square. Ezekiel, Sarah, and Jacob were led out in chains, their faces showing different expressions in those final moments. Ezekiel looked straight ahead, his jaw set, accepting his fate with the same cold practicality he'd shown throughout his life. Sarah wept quietly, her thin frame shaking. Jacob stared at the crowd with undisguised contempt, his lips moving in what might have been curses or prayers. The sheriff read the charges and sentences. A local minister offered prayers for their souls. Then the hoods were placed, the nooses adjusted. At precisely 10 a.m. the trapdoors opened. According to newspaper accounts from that day, all three died quickly, their necks broken by the fall. The bodies were cut down after 20 minutes and buried in unmarked graves outside the town cemetery. No markers were placed. The location was deliberately left unrecorded. The remaining family members were transported to the state penitentiary in Eddyville. Martha and Mary died within 6 months of each other in 1903, both from tuberculosis according to prison records, though some whispered that the twins couldn't survive separation from each other or from the mountains that had been their hunting ground. Daniel served his 20 years and was released in 1919, immediately leaving Kentucky and never being heard from again. Ruth died in prison in 1914. Samuel, after his time in reformatory school, was adopted by a distant relative in Tennessee and given a new name. He lived until 1962, dying at age 75 and never once returned to Pike County. The Mullins homestead was burned to the ground by vigilantes 3 days after the execution. The land was deemed cursed and no one would live there again. Devil's Fork returned to wilderness, the trails growing over, the cabin's blackened foundation stones slowly disappearing under layers of leaves and moss. The cave system was officially sealed by the county, with warning signs posted, though in truth there was no way to truly seal it. The entrances were too numerous, too hidden. Local parents began using the story as a warning to children. Stay away from Devil's Fork, stay away from the caves, or the Mullins family's ghosts will pull you down into the dark. Over the decades that followed, various attempts were made to explore the shafts where bodies had been disposed of, but the technical challenges proved insurmountable. The passages are too narrow, too deep, too unstable. The victims of the Mullins family remain there still, somewhere in the darkness beneath the mountains, in places no light will ever reach. The exact number of people killed by the Mullins family has never been determined with certainty. Samuel's estimate of 30 to 40 victims is generally accepted, but it could be more. Missing persons reports from that era were incomplete, especially for drifters, Native Americans, and freed slaves traveling through the region. Some historians suggest the number could be as high as 60. The case had lasting effects on Pike County and eastern Kentucky as a whole. It shattered the isolation that had allowed such horrors to go unchecked for so long. Roads were improved, communication with county seats became more regular, and law enforcement presence increased dramatically. The mountains were being opened up for better and worse, but the story also became embedded in Appalachian folklore. The Mullins family joined the ranks of cautionary tales, whispered warnings about what happens when isolation breeds evil, when family loyalty becomes corrupted into conspiracy, when the mountain's ability to hide secrets is exploited for monstrous purposes. To this day, elderly residents of Pike County will tell you that Devil's Fork is still cursed. Hunters report feeling watched in those woods. Hikers describe an oppressive atmosphere, a sense of dread that increases as you move deeper into the hollow. Strange sounds echo from the sealed cave entrances, sounds that might be wind through limestone passages, or might be something else entirely. The mountains remember. The mountains keep. And on quiet nights in eastern Kentucky, when fog settles into the valleys and the moon hides behind clouds, people still report seeing lights moving through the forest near Devil's Fork. Lantern lights, they say, bobbing along old trails that should be empty. The lights of a family still hunting, still searching, still practicing their dark craft in the only place they ever called home. The story of the Mullins family remains a disturbing reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, sometimes it grows slowly, fed by isolation and moral decay, until it becomes something monstrous that an entire community is too frightened to confront. The mountains that gave the Mullins family shelter also enabled their crimes, providing the perfect terrain for predators who understood how to exploit darkness and distance. But questions remain. Were there other families involved? Some historians believe the Mullins couldn't have operated alone for so long, without at least some complicity from neighbors. Did some of the stolen goods pass through other hands? Were there warnings that went unheeded? And perhaps most haunting, are there other Devil's Forks out there, other isolated places where darkness still thrives unseen? The case files remain in Pike County records, yellowed and fragile now, documenting in fading ink the scope of horror that unfolded in those mountains. Researchers occasionally request access drawn by the dark fascination of systematic murder in an era before modern forensics. before FBI databases, before the term serial killer even existed. The Mullins family were in many ways ahead of their time, organized, methodical, capable of long-term planning and cooperative violence. They were also a product of their time, isolated, desperate, living by rules that existed nowhere else, in a landscape that forgave nothing and remembered everything. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between survival and savagery, between family loyalty and moral corruption, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the respect and depth they require. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own thoughts on how isolation affects human morality, or any encounters you've had with the darker corners of history in your own regions. These stories matter not because they sensationalize violence, but because they remind us that evil is often ordinary, often close to home, often hidden in plain sight until someone finally has the courage to look directly at it. The mountains of eastern Kentucky still stand, unchanged by human drama, indifferent to human suffering. They hold their secrets close, revealing them only when they choose, only when the time is right. And in the deepest caves, in the darkest shafts, in places no one will ever reach, the mountains continue their eternal work of keeping and remembering. Until next time, may your own darkness remain safely in the past, and may the mountains you travel through hold only beauty and wonder, never horror. But the story of the Mullins family doesn't end with 3 bodies swinging from gallows in Pikeville, or with a burned homestead returning to wilderness. The true horror, the part that historians and criminologists continue to study more than a century later, lies in what happened after. In the ripples that spread outward from Devil's Fork, touching lives and shaping destinies in ways that the family themselves could never have imagined. In the months following the executions, Sheriff William Bowling became obsessed with understanding what he'd uncovered. He couldn't accept that he'd arrived at the truth too late for 30 or 40 victims, perhaps more. He began conducting his own investigation into the family's history, traveling to neighboring counties, interviewing anyone who might have known the Mullins before they became monsters. What Bowling discovered was perhaps more disturbing than the crimes themselves. The Mullins family hadn't always been evil. Ezekiel Mullins had been born in 1847, the son of a farmer who'd owned a modest plot of land in what was then still Virginia, before the formation of West Virginia during the Civil War. According to county records that Bowling unearthed, young Ezekiel had been unremarkable, a hard-working boy who attended church regularly, who helped his father with crops, who courted Sarah Blackburn with all the proper decorum expected of young mountain folk. They'd married in 1866, just after the war ended. Ezekiel was 19, Sarah 17. They'd moved to Kentucky seeking better land, cheaper land, away from the devastation that had consumed Virginia. The first years were hard but honest. They had Jacob in 1867. The twins came in 1869. They farmed tobacco, raised hogs, sold ginseng root to buyers who came through once a season. Then came the winter of 1873. It was one of the worst winters in Appalachian history. Snow fell from November through March in quantities that made travel impossible. Game disappeared. Streams froze solid. The Mullins family, isolated in Devil's Fork with 3 young children and a 4th on the way, began to starve. According to a diary entry that Bowling found in a neighbor's possession, a diary kept by a woman who'd known Sarah Mullins, Ezekiel had made a decision that winter. A traveler had stumbled to their cabin, half-frozen, delirious with cold. The man carried a satchel with food, warm clothes, and gold coins. Ezekiel let him in, fed him, warmed him by the fire, and then, when Sarah had taken the children outside to give them what little food remained, Ezekiel killed him. The diary entry, dated April 1873, recorded Sarah's confession to her friend. Zeke says it was necessary. Says the man would have died anyway from the cold. Says God will understand that we had to feed our babies. But I see it in his eyes now. Something changed. Something broke. That first murder, born of desperation rather than malice, appears to have opened a door that Ezekiel couldn't close. The family survived that winter on the dead man's supplies. When spring came, they had enough seed to plant. They rebuilt. But Ezekiel had learned something terrible, that survival could be taken from others and the mountains would hide the evidence. The killing didn't resume immediately. Years passed. More children were born, Daniel in 1875, Ruth in 1877, Samuel in 1879, little Ezra in 1881. But Ezekiel was different now, harder, and he was raising his children to see the world through his transformed eyes. He taught them that the mountains gave and took without mercy, that the strong survived and the weak perished, that outsiders were threats or opportunities, nothing more. Jacob, the eldest son, absorbed these lessons most completely. By age 15, he'd helped his father kill a second man, a debt collector who'd come seeking payment for farm equipment. By 18, Jacob was suggesting victims himself. The twins, Martha and Mary, grew up in this atmosphere of normalized violence, learning to use their beauty and femininity as weapons, understanding that their role was to disarm and deceive. Sheriff Bowling documented all of this in a personal journal that he never made public during his lifetime. It was discovered after his death in 1923, and it paints a portrait of a family that didn't start evil but became evil, gradually, through a combination of desperation, isolation, and a patriarch who'd made one terrible choice and then built an entire philosophy around justifying it. The journal contains another revelation that Bowling kept secret. He believed there were other families operating similarly in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. He'd found patterns of disappearances in 3 other remote counties, clusters of missing persons reports that suggested systematic predation, but without the kind of breakthrough he'd had with the Mullins case, without accidental discovery of a cache of evidence, he couldn't prove anything. Bowling spent the last 23 years of his life investigating these patterns. He never solved another case like the Mullins murders. The journal's final entry, written just weeks before a stroke took his life, reads, "The mountains hide so much. I wonder how many other Devil's Forks exist. How many other families learned the wrong lessons about survival. I wonder if anyone will ever know the true scale of what happened in these hills during the years after the war, when law was distant and life was cheap. I wonder if God will forgive me for not finding them all. But what of the children who survived? Samuel Mullins, the youngest, who'd testified against his family and been sent to reformatory school, carried scars that never healed. The reformatory records, which were unsealed in 1965 after his death, reveal a boy who barely spoke for the first 6 months of his incarceration. When he did begin talking, it was to describe nightmares that recurred nightly. Dreams of falling down dark shafts, of hands reaching up from stone throats, of his father's voice whispering that the mountains remember. The reformatory supervisor, a man named Theodore Walsh, took particular interest in Samuel's case. Walsh kept detailed notes on the boy's psychological state, and these notes provide a window into the mind of someone who'd been raised in systematic evil, but hadn't yet been fully corrupted by it. Samuel exhibits what I can only describe as moral confusion, Walsh wrote in 1901. He understands that what his family did was wrong. The evidence of that understanding is in his testimony, in his willingness to speak truth. But he also loves them. He cries for his mother at night. He asks about his sisters. He defends his father's early actions, explaining about the winter of 1873, about starvation, about choices made in desperation. He cannot reconcile these two realities, that his family were murderers, and that they were also the people who raised him, who taught him to read, who sang him songs at bedtime. Walsh became something of a father figure to Samuel, helping him process trauma, teaching him that evil actions don't erase human complexity, but also don't excuse moral accountability. When Samuel was released at age 18 in 1905, Walsh helped arrange his adoption by distant relatives in Tennessee, and gave him advice that Samuel reportedly carried for the rest of his life. You are not responsible for what your family did, but you are responsible for who you choose to become. The mountains taught you to survive. Now you must learn to live. Samuel took the name Samuel Blackburn, his grandmother's maiden name, and disappeared into rural Tennessee. He married in 1910, had 4 children, worked as a carpenter and farmer. His wife, according to family stories that emerged after his death, never knew his true identity. His children didn't learn until after he passed that their father had been born a Mullins, that his family had been executed for murder, that he'd testified at age 12 against his own parents. The family discovered letters that Samuel had written but never sent, dozens of them, addressed to Martha and Mary, to Daniel and Ruth, to his mother Sarah. Letters seeking forgiveness for his testimony, letters asking if they understood why he'd spoken. Letters describing his life, his marriage, his children, his desperate hope that he'd broken the cycle of violence that had consumed his birth family. One letter, dated 1945, reads, "Mother, If somehow you can hear me from wherever you are, I need you to know that I tried to be good. I raised my children to respect life, to value honesty, to see other people as human beings and not as opportunities. I taught them the opposite of everything Pa taught me. I broke what he built. I hope that counts for something. I hope that somewhere in the darkness where you ended up, there's a small light that comes from knowing at least one of your sons chose differently. The psychological impact on Samuel Mullins provides a case study that criminal psychologists still reference today. How does a child emerge from a family dedicated to systematic murder? What factors allow some children raised in extreme evil to reject that evil, while others embrace it? Samuel's testimony, his cooperation, his apparent moral clarity at age 12. These suggest a resilience that researchers still don't fully understand, but perhaps the most uncomfortable legacy of the Mullins case is what it revealed about community complicity. As more details emerged in the years following the trial, it became clear that the family hadn't operated in complete secrecy. People had known, or at least they'd suspected. A newspaper investigation conducted by the Louisville Courier-Journal in 1902 interviewed dozens of Pike County residents who'd lived near Devil's Fork during the Mullins family's reign of terror. The accounts they provided painted a picture of willful blindness, of a community that chose not to see what was happening because seeing would require action, and action was dangerous. "We all knew something wasn't right about them, Mullins," said one neighbor who insisted on remaining anonymous. "Too many folks went into that hollow and didn't come out. Too many possessions showing up that didn't belong to them, but what were we supposed to do? Ezekiel and Jacob were dangerous men. The family was large. We had our own children to protect. Sometimes you look away to keep your own family safe." Another resident, a storekeeper in a nearby settlement, admitted to purchasing goods from the Mullins family that he suspected were stolen. They'd bring in quality items, things that mountain folk don't usually own, fine pocket watches, silver jewelry, leather bags. I knew, of course I knew. But I had a business to run and they paid fair prices. You tell yourself stories. You say maybe they found these things, maybe someone gave them as gifts. You don't ask questions because you don't want answers. Even local clergy weren't immune to this willful ignorance. A Baptist minister who'd served the region during the 1890s confessed in his later years that he'd suspected the Mullins family was behind the disappearances, but had never contacted authorities. "I am ashamed to admit that I prioritized the comfort of my congregation over the pursuit of justice. When I raised concerns about the missing people, about the dark rumors surrounding that family, I was told in no uncertain terms to let it be. Mountain justice is mountain justice," they said. "Not for church folk to meddle in." I told myself I was maintaining peace, keeping the community together. Now I see I was simply a coward. This community silence allowed the Mullins family to operate for years longer than should have been possible. If even one person had contacted authorities earlier, if even one neighbor had been willing to testify about suspicious activities, lives could have been saved. The victims, dozens of them, died not just because a family became monstrous, but because an entire community chose comfort over courage. The Courier-Journal investigation concluded with a damning editorial that remains relevant today. The Han Mountains of eastern Kentucky must reckon with an uncomfortable truth. The Mullins family could not have sustained their campaign of terror without the tacit cooperation of their neighbors. Evil requires not just perpetrators but enablers, and in this case, an entire region enabled evil through silence, through fear. Through a cultural commitment to minding one's own business even when minding one's own business means allowing murder to flourish. This is not mountain justice, this is mountain failure. In 1967, a team of forensic anthropologists from the University of Kentucky attempted what earlier investigators had deemed impossible. They sought to explore the deep shafts in the cave system where the Mullins family had disposed of bodies. The team was led by Dr. Margaret Ashford, a pioneering forensic scientist who'd gained national recognition for her work identifying Civil War casualties. She believed that modern equipment and techniques might allow access to chambers that had been unreachable in 1899. With permission from Pike County authorities and funding from the National Science Foundation, she assembled a team of cave explorers, forensic experts, and archaeologists. What they discovered both confirmed the horror of the Mullins crimes and added new layers of mystery to the case. The team managed to descend approximately 140 feet into one of the primary disposal shafts, twice as far as the 1899 miners had reached. At that depth, the shaft opened into a large chamber with an underground stream. The chamber was roughly 60 feet across with a ceiling lost in darkness above, and it was full of bones. Dr. Ashford's report, published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 1969, documented the recovery of skeletal remains representing at least 47 individuals. The bones were scattered throughout the chamber, broken by impact from falls, jumbled together by the action of water picked clean by cave-dwelling creatures. Some had been there for decades, judging by the degree of deterioration. Others appeared more recent. But here's where the mystery deepens. Carbon dating and forensic analysis revealed that not all the remains dated to the Mullins family's active period. Some bones were much older, dating to the 1840s and 1850s, before Ezekiel Mullins was even born. Other remains appeared to be more recent, potentially dating to the 1910s and 1920s, long after the Mullins family had been executed or imprisoned. Dr. Ashford's conclusion was as disturbing as the original discovery. The evidence suggests that the Mullins family discovered a disposal site that was already in use by unknown parties, and that the site continued to be used by others after the Mullins family was removed. This cave system appears to have served as a dumping ground for murder victims across multiple decades, possibly used by multiple perpetrators. The Mullins family were not the beginning of this horror, nor were they the end. Sheriff Bowling's suspicions, it seemed, had been correct. There were other families, other individuals, who'd learned to use the mountain's darkness for evil purposes. The Mullins clan had simply been the ones who got caught. The 1967 expedition recovered as many remains as possible, but the chamber's instability and the danger of further descent meant that many bones, perhaps the majority, were left in place. The shaft was permanently sealed afterward, not with concrete or steel but with knowledge of its location removed from public record. Dr. Ashford argued in her report that the site should be designated as a mass grave and left undisturbed, a tomb for victims whose names would never be known. Attempts to identify the recovered remains using forensic techniques available in the 1960s had limited success. 12 individuals were tentatively identified through comparison with missing persons reports and dental records. 5 were confirmed. 2 children, 2 women, and 1 elderly man, all matching descriptions of people who'd disappeared in Pike County between 1895 and 1898. The others remain unknown to this day, their bones stored in the University of Kentucky's forensic collection, waiting for technologies that might someday reveal their identities. In 2008, the case captured new attention when true crime researcher James Holland published Devil's Fork, America's First Family of Serial Killers, a comprehensive book that assembled all available evidence about the Mullins family and contextualized their crimes within the broader history of American murder. Holland spent 5 years researching the book, tracking down descendants of survivors, examining archived court documents, interviewing historians and forensic experts. His work revealed several stunning new facts that had been lost to time. First, he discovered that Martha and Mary Mullins, the twins, had left behind written materials. Before their deaths in prison in 1903, they'd collaborated on a manuscript, a kind of confession or memoir, that had been confiscated by prison officials and filed away in state archives. Holland obtained permission to examine these documents, and what he found was both chilling and psychologically fascinating. The twins wrote in alternating passages, their handwriting so similar it was nearly impossible to distinguish. They described their childhood, their education and murder, their role as lures for victims, but they also provided insight into their psychological state that sheds light on how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil. "We did not think of them as people," one passage reads. "Father taught us that outsiders were like deer or rabbits. They existed to provide for us. We felt no more guilt about killing a traveler than we felt about slaughtering a hog. This was survival. This was life in the mountains. When we smiled at a man and offered him water, we were setting a trap, no different than the snares we set for game animals. It wasn't personal. It wasn't hatred. It was simply what we did." Another passage reveals the emotional disconnection that allowed the twins to participate in dozens of murders. "Mary and I were 2 halves of one person. We shared everything, thoughts, feelings, dreams. But that oneness made everyone else less real to us. Other people existed outside our circle, beyond our concern. Only the family mattered. Only survival mattered." Looking back now, from this prison where they've locked us away from each other, From the mountains, from everything that made sense to us, I can see that we were wrong. But I cannot feel that we were wrong. The knowing and the feeling remain separate. This manuscript, which Holland published excerpts from in his book, provides one of the earliest examples of serial killers attempting to explain their own psychology. It's a document that forensic psychologists continue to study, trying to understand how family dynamics, isolation, and learned behavior can override normal human empathy and moral development. Holland's book also tracked down 3 living descendants of Samuel Mullins, 2 granddaughters and 1 grandson, all in their 60s and 70s by 2008. They'd known their grandfather as a quiet, gentle man who worked with wood, who told stories, who never raised his voice. Learning his true history had been devastating. One granddaughter, who agreed to speak with Holland on condition of anonymity, said, "My grandfather was the kindest man I ever knew. He taught me to see beauty in small things, the grain of wood, the first flower of spring, the way light comes through morning fog. He died when I was 16, and I grieved him terribly. Then, years later, my father sat me down and told me the truth about who Grandpa Samuel had been, about the family he came from. It shattered something in me. How could someone who'd witnessed such evil, who'd been raised by monsters, become so gentle? I still don't understand it. But I think maybe that was his entire life's work, being the opposite of what he came from, being proof that you can break free." The Mullins case has influenced American culture in ways both obvious and subtle. It's been referenced in true crime documentaries, inspired fictional accounts, and become a cautionary tale taught in criminology courses across the country. But its deeper impact lies in how it changed conversations about family loyalty, community responsibility, and the roots of evil. In Appalachian communities specifically, the case forced a reckoning with romanticized notions of mountain independence and family bonds. The idea that we take care of our own, and outsiders don't understand our ways, had long been sources of regional pride. The Mullins family represented the dark side of those values, showing how isolation can breed horror, how family loyalty can become conspiracy, how suspicion of outsiders can enable predation. Modern scholars of Appalachian studies point to the Mullins case as a turning point in the region's relationship with law enforcement and outside authority. Before 1900, federal and state intervention in mountain communities was generally resisted. After the Mullins trial and execution, attitudes began to shift. Communities that had once handled problems internally began to recognize that some evils were too large, too systematic, to be addressed without outside help. The case also influenced American criminology in foundational ways. When the FBI established its behavioral science unit in 1972, the Mullins family was among the historical cases studied as examples of cooperative family-based serial murder. Their methods, the use of female family members as lures, the systematic disposal of bodies in difficult-to-access locations, the long-term sustainability of their operation, became reference points for understanding how organized criminal families operate. More recently, the 2019 discovery of a similar family operation in rural Alaska drew immediate comparisons to the Mullins case. A family of 6 had been using their remote homestead as a base for robbing and killing hunters and tourists over a period of approximately 8 years. When authorities raided the property, they found a cache of victims' possessions similar to what had been discovered in the Mullins cave, and bodies buried throughout the vast property. The parallels were so striking that FBI investigators specifically referenced the Pike County case in their reports, noting that extreme isolation combined with family cooperation creates conditions where systematic murder can persist largely undetected. For decades after the trial, the victims of the Mullins family existed primarily as numbers in court documents and speculation in newspaper articles. But in 2015, a dedicated genealogist named Catherine Porter began a project that would finally give faces and stories to some of those who'd disappeared into Devil's Fork. Porter, whose own great-aunt had vanished in Pike County in 1898, spent 7 years cross-referencing missing persons reports with census records, church registries, family Bible entries, and gravestone inscriptions. Her goal was simple but profound: to identify as many victims as possible and tell their stories so they would be remembered as people, not statistics. The results of her research, published as a website and accompanying book titled Remembered: The Victims of Devil's Fork, brought heartbreaking humanity to the case. Each victim she identified received a biographical entry: who they were, where they came from, where they were going when they disappeared, who mourned them. Thomas Wickham, the peddler who vanished in April 1897, was 43 years old, a father of 5, a widower who'd taken up peddling after his wife died of influenza. He'd been saving money to bring his children from Virginia to Kentucky, where he planned to buy a small farm. His eldest daughter, Emma, waited for him to return for 16 years before finally accepting he was dead. She never married, spending her life caring for her younger siblings and dying in 1954, with a photograph of her father kept in a locket around her neck. The young couple who disappeared in May 1897 were Daniel and Rebecca Lawson, both 19 years old, married just 3 months. They'd been traveling to Rebecca's parents' home to share the news that Rebecca was pregnant. Their families searched for weeks, calling their names through the mountains, finding nothing. Rebecca's mother went to her grave in 1923, believing her daughter would somehow return, keeping a lamp burning in the window every night for 26 years. Among the most heartbreaking cases Porter documented was that of 2 brothers, William and Thomas Pritchard, ages 8 and 10, who'd gone hunting on a November morning in 1898 and never came home. According to Samuel Mullins' testimony, the boys had stumbled too close to the Mullins property while tracking a deer. Jacob and Daniel Mullins had captured them, brought them to the cave, and after a debate about whether children should be spared, Ezekiel made the final decision. The mountains taught hard lessons, he reportedly said. The boys knew too much. They'd seen the family's faces. The Pritchard brothers' mother, Sarah Pritchard, lost her mind after their disappearance. According to medical records that Porter uncovered, Sarah would wander into the mountains calling for her sons, sometimes for days at a time, until neighbors would find her and bring her home. She was eventually committed to a sanitarium in 1902, where she died in 1909, having never stopped believing her boys would come back. Porter's research identified 23 victims by name, just over half of Samuel's estimated count. Each entry in her book includes photographs when available, excerpts from letters or diaries, testimony from relatives, and descriptions of how the families coped with never knowing what happened to their loved ones. The project transformed the Mullins case from an abstract horror story into something far more personal and devastating. These were real people with real lives, real dreams, real families who loved them, Porter wrote in her introduction. They were erased not just by murder but by being forgotten, by becoming footnotes in a sensational story about their killers. This book is my attempt to reverse that, to make the victims more memorable than the family that killed them, to ensure that when people tell the story of Devil's Fork, they remember the names of the innocent as clearly as they remember the names of the guilty. Porter's work has been used by law enforcement agencies as a model for victim identification in cold cases. It demonstrates how genealogical research, combined with historical records, can recover identities and restore dignity to victims decades or even centuries after their deaths. The FBI has cited Porter's methodology in training materials for their violent criminal apprehension program. No discussion of the Mullins case would be complete without addressing the persistent paranormal claims associated with Devil's Fork and the cave system. Since the early 1900s, the area has been a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and those who believe the horror that occurred there left some kind of spiritual residue. The claims are numerous and consistent across more than a century of reports. Hikers describe feeling overwhelming dread when approaching the hollow, a sensation so powerful that some turn back rather than continue. Hunters report hearing voices calling from the trees, voices that sound like women singing or children crying or men whispering in languages they can't quite understand. Photographers have captured unexplained lights and shadowy figures in images taken near the sealed cave entrances. Most famously, there are the lantern lights, unexplained illuminations seen moving through the forest at night, following paths that correspond to the old trails the Mullins family would have used. These sightings have been reported consistently since at least 1920, documented by dozens of witnesses over the decades, including police officers, forest rangers, and skeptical investigators who went looking specifically to debunk the claims. In 1978, a team from the American Society for Psychical Research conducted a formal investigation of Devil's Fork. They spent 3 weeks in the area, using instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, and radiation levels. They interviewed local residents, examined historical accounts, and spent multiple nights in the forest with recording equipment. Their report, while carefully worded to maintain scientific credibility, was remarkable. The team documented several unexplained phenomena: consistent temperature drops of 15-20 degrees Fahrenheit in specific locations, with no apparent natural cause, electromagnetic readings that suggested unusual activity, and audio recordings that captured what sounded like distant voices speaking in patterns consistent with human speech, though no words could be clearly distinguished. The team leader, Dr. Howard Marks, concluded, "While we cannot definitively attribute the phenomena we observed to paranormal causes, we also cannot explain them through conventional means. The consistency of reports across decades combined with our own documented experiences suggests something unusual is occurring in this location. Whether that represents genuine spiritual activity, some unknown natural phenomenon, or mass psychological suggestion remains open to investigation." Skeptics, of course, have alternative explanations. The temperature anomalies could result from underground water flows creating localized cooling effects. The electromagnetic readings might reflect mineral deposits in the limestone. The voices could be wind moving through cave entrances and tree branches, creating sounds that human brains interpret as speech, a phenomenon called audio pareidolia. The lights might be atmospheric effects or even bioluminescent fungi, which are known to exist in Appalachian forests. Dr. Rachel Chen, a geologist who studied the Devil's Fork area in 2003, argued strongly against paranormal interpretations. The cave systems in this region create unusual acoustic and atmospheric conditions. Sound travels in unexpected ways. Air pressure changes as weather systems move through. Limestone formations can produce natural light effects under certain conditions. Add in human psychology, the knowledge that terrible things happened here, the expectation of experiencing something unusual, and you have a perfect recipe for misinterpreting natural phenomena as supernatural. Yet the reports continue. As recently as 2021, a group of college students camping legally in the national forest, land that now encompasses the Devil's Fork area, reported seeing lights moving through the trees and hearing what they described as women singing in harmony but sad, like a funeral song. They captured video on their phones that shows unclear lights moving between trees, footage that has been analyzed by both paranormal enthusiasts and skeptics, with each side claiming it supports their interpretation. Whether Devil's Fork is truly haunted or simply the subject of persistent myth-making, the paranormal claims have become an inseparable part of the case's legacy. They represent perhaps a psychological need to believe that evil of such magnitude cannot simply end with executions and prison sentences, that it must leave some mark on the physical world, some echo that reminds the living of what occurred there. In 2018, a controversy erupted when a Kentucky tourism company announced plans to offer dark history tours of Pike County, including guided hikes to the general area of Devil's Fork and educational presentations about the Mullins case. The proposal sparked intense debate about the ethics of commercializing tragedy and the difference between historical education and exploitation. Proponents argued that responsible historical tourism could serve educational purposes, helping people understand both the crimes themselves and the broader social conditions that enabled them. They pointed to successful dark tourism sites like the 9/11 Memorial, Holocaust museums, and Civil War battlefields as examples of tragedy being commemorated respectfully. History should not be sanitized, argued Marcus Thompson, the tour company owner. What happened at Devil's Fork is part of American history, part of Appalachian history. Ignoring it doesn't honor the victims, it erases them a second time. A well-designed educational experience can teach people about the real consequences of isolation, about how communities enable evil through silence, about the importance of law enforcement and civic responsibility. That has value. Opponents, however, saw the proposal as ghoulish exploitation. A coalition of Pike County residents, historians, and descendants of both victims and the Mullins family launched a petition opposing the tours, gathering over 15,000 signatures. Catherine Porter, the genealogist who had worked to identify victims, wrote an op-ed in the Lexington Herald-Leader condemning the proposal. These were real people who died terrified deaths and were thrown into dark holes in the earth. Their families grieved them for generations. And now we want to turn that suffering into entertainment? We want tourists taking selfies near the place where children were murdered. This isn't education, it's voyeurism, dressed up in academic language. The debate became particularly heated when descendants of Sarah Pritchard, the mother who'd lost her mind grieving her murdered sons, held a press conference opposing the tours. Margaret Pritchard Williams, Sarah's great-great-granddaughter, spoke emotionally about her family's multi-generational trauma. My great-great-grandmother died in an asylum, broken by grief because she never knew what happened to her babies. Now, more than a century later, people want to profit from that pain. They want to walk through the mountains where my ancestors' bones lie in darkness and call it tourism. Some wounds should be left alone. Some places should remain unmarked. Some stories should be told, yes, but told with reverence, not packaged as entertainment. The tourism company ultimately withdrew their proposal in the face of community opposition, but the debate raised questions that remain unresolved. How should society handle dark historical sites? What's the difference between education and exploitation? Who has the right to decide how tragedy is commemorated or presented? Similar debates have occurred around other serial killer cases, from Jack the Ripper tours in London to Jeffrey Dahmer walking tours in Milwaukee. The Mullins case added a new dimension because of its rural setting. The fact that Devil's Fork isn't a public site, but rather a remote wilderness area where the families of victims might feel entitled to privacy and respect that urban serial killer sites don't receive. The National Park Service, which manages the federal forest land that now encompasses the historical Devil's Fork area, issued guidelines in 2019 prohibiting commercial tour operations in the specific region and requesting that visitors who hike there do so with respect and understanding that they are entering what is essentially a mass grave site. The guidelines stop short of restricting access entirely, but encourage visitors to approach this area with the solemnity appropriate to a place where great suffering occurred. Despite more than 120 years of investigation, research, and analysis, significant questions about the Mullins case remain unanswered, mysteries that may never be solved. First, there's the question of total victim count. Samuel Mullins estimated 30 to 40, but his estimate was based on incomplete knowledge. He was young, often kept away from the most violent aspects of the family's operation, and wasn't present for every killing. The 1967 forensic expedition found remains of 47 individuals, but acknowledged that many more bones likely remain in unexplored portions of the cave system. Some researchers believe the true count could exceed 75 victims spanning from the 1840s through the 1920s, involving multiple perpetrators beyond just the Mullins family. Second, there's the mystery of accomplices. Did the Mullins family operate entirely independently, or were there others involved? Some historians point to evidence suggesting the family had help disposing of goods, that they had contacts who helped them trade stolen items in distant markets, that they may have even warned them when authorities were getting close. A notation in Sheriff Bowling's journal mentions, 3 names I cannot prove, 3 families I suspect but cannot touch. He never identified these families, and the journal provides no other clues. Third, what happened to little Ezra, the youngest Mullins child? Court records show he was 10 years old at the time of his family's arrest in 1899. He was deemed too young to stand trial and was placed in an orphanage, but after that the historical record goes silent. No adoption papers, no death certificate, no subsequent appearances in census records under that name. It's as if he vanished as completely as his family's victims. Some researchers believe he was adopted and given a new identity to protect him from his family's infamy. Others wonder if he died young, perhaps in the orphanage, and his death simply went unrecorded. A few darker theories suggest he escaped and continued his family's work, though no evidence supports this. Fourth, there's the question of the pre-1873 victims, the remains found in the cave that dated to before Ezekiel Mullins ever lived in Devil's Fork. Who killed those people? Was there another family using the same caves for the same purpose? Was there a tradition of murder in that particular hollow, passed down or discovered independently by successive inhabitants? The cave system may hold answers, but those answers lie in darkness too deep and dangerous to reach. Finally, there's the question that haunts everyone who studies this case. Could it happen again? Are there other remote places where families or individuals use isolation as cover for systematic violence? The 2019 Alaska case suggests the answer might be yes. But how many others exist undetected? How many missing persons cases in rural America involve victims who ended up in places like Devil's Fork? Their disappearances attributed to accidents or simple tragedy when the truth is far darker. These questions ensure that the Mullins case remains not just historical curiosity, but ongoing cautionary tale. They remind us that evil can flourish in shadows, that isolation enables horror, that the price of looking away can be counted in unmarked graves. Or PM 11 to 12/20/25. The story of the Mullins family, this journey through generations of darkness, through caves that swallowed innocence, through a community's failure and a killer family's systematic evil, ends without the clean resolution we might wish for. There are too many unanswered questions. Too many bodies never recovered, too many victims whose names we'll never know. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the discomfort we feel at the story's incompleteness mirrors the discomfort that Pike County residents felt in 1899, when they realized how long evil had flourished among them. Perhaps our frustration at not knowing everything mirrors the frustration of families who never learned what happened to their missing loved ones. What we do know is this: evil is not always dramatic. It doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs or monstrous appearance. Sometimes evil wears a familiar face. Sometimes it offers you water when you're thirsty, smiles when you approach, speaks in soft mountain accent that sounds like home. Sometimes evil is a family working together, justifying horror through twisted logic about survival and strength. We know that communities bear responsibility for what they permit through silence. The neighbors who suspected, the merchants who profited, the clergy who looked away. They didn't kill anyone themselves, but their inaction enabled killing to continue. There's a lesson there about civic courage, about the moral obligation to speak uncomfortable truths even when silence is safer. We know that trauma echoes through generations. Samuel Mullins' descendants, the families of victims, the community itself, all carry scars from events that happened more than a century ago. Evil doesn't end when the perpetrators are caught. It ripples outward, touching lives far removed from the original crimes, shaping identities and communities in ways both obvious and subtle. And we know that the earth keeps its secrets. Somewhere beneath the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in chambers no living person has ever seen, the victims of Devil's Fork remain. The mountains remember, the mountains keep, and perhaps in their ancient patient way the mountains judge. On quiet nights when fog settles into the hollows and the moon hides behind clouds, the lights still appear in the forest near Devil's Fork. Lanterns moving through the trees, following old trails, searching for something. Are they psychological projections? Our minds creating meaning from random atmospheric phenomena? Are they genuine hauntings, the restless dead unable to find peace? Or are they warnings, reminders that darkness can flourish anywhere people choose to look away? The answer matters less than the question itself. The fact that we still see those lights, still tell this story, still feel uneasy when contemplating what happened in those mountains, that's what ensures the Mullins family's victims are not forgotten. Every time someone researches this case, every time their story is told with respect and solemnity, every time we use their example to examine our own communities and ask hard questions about what we permit through silence, the victims are remembered. Their deaths meant something. Their absence continues to teach. If this extended journey through one of America's darkest family conspiracies has moved you, if you find yourself contemplating the thin line between survival and savagery, between family loyalty and moral accountability, then you've honored the memory of those who disappeared into Devil's Fork. You've done what their contemporaries failed to do. You've looked directly at evil and refused to turn away. Consider subscribing to The Untold Hour for more stories like this, histories that demand to be examined, mysteries that refuse easy answers, truths that haunt us because they reveal uncomfortable realities about human nature and society's failures. These are not comfortable stories, but they are necessary ones. Leave a like if this account has challenged you to think about your own community's responsibilities, about what you might be permitting through silence, about how isolation and fear enable evil to flourish, and comment with your reflections on the questions this case raises. How do we balance historical education with respect for victims? What responsibility do communities bear for crimes committed in their midst? Can someone raised in evil truly break free as Samuel Mullins apparently did? The mountains of Pike County still stand unchanged by human drama, indifferent to human suffering. They will outlast all of us, holding their secrets long after the last person who remembers the Mullins family has died. But for now, while memory persists, while the story can still be told, we have an obligation to tell it completely honestly, with respect for all whose lives were touched by darkness. Devil's Fork remains unmarked on modern maps. You won't find signs directing you there, won't find historical markers explaining what occurred. The land has returned to wilderness, accessible only to those who know the old trails, who understand the mountains, who are willing to walk into places where shadows lie thick even at noon. Maybe that's as it should be. Some places earn their obscurity. Some stories should require effort to discover. Some lessons should be difficult to learn. But learn them we must, because somewhere in some remote place isolation might be enabling evil right now. Somewhere, a community might be looking away from suspicious patterns. Somewhere, victims might be disappearing into darkness while the world goes on, unaware or uncaring. The Mullins family taught us that evil flourishes in shadows and dies in light. So we shine light on their story, on their victims, on the community that failed and the individuals who suffered. We illuminate the darkness not to sensationalize horror, but to ensure it cannot flourish again unnoticed. Until next time, may you walk in light. May your communities choose courage over comfort. May you never have reason to wonder what secrets your mountains keep. And may the victims of Devil's Fork, all of them known and unknown, remembered and forgotten, finally rest in the peace they were denied in life. The mountains remember, but now so do we.